Hey everybody, welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games. Today we continue my top 100 board games of all time, covering games number 60 through 51. The last set of 10 before we cross over into the top 50. Now for this particular set of 10, I only have 2 new games to the list. That means of the 100 plus games that I learned in the calendar year of 2021, only 2 of them made it to this particular section of the list. So without any further ado, let's get straight to the list with my number 60, and this is not one of those 2 new games. This game was on the list last year at number 22, so it's a pretty significant drop, and that is Carcassonne the Castle, designed by Reiner Knizia. Now, this is a 2-player only iteration of Carcassonne. It's one of 2 or maybe 3 Carcassonne iterations that were not designed by Klaus-Jürgen Wrede. This right here was actually made by Reiner Knizia, one of my favorite designers. And this game is out of print and was for a long time a grail game of mine. I was able to get this game about 2 years ago and play it, and it's been on my top 100 ever since, although it has climbed down this year. Now, the really cool thing about this game is that it's a 2-player only version of Carcassonne, in which the space that players are working on, their table area, is confined by the score track, which represents a castle wall. And all of the tiles that you play have to go within that confine. And it's very interesting because, first of all, it limits you in some ways because now you cannot have an indefinite amount of area to place your tiles on. At the same time, it does create some additional opportunities because players have additional places where they can place their starting tiles on, because they can connect it to different parts of the wall, as opposed to the base game where you have one starting tile and that's absolutely where you have to go from. Really cool, really neat. There's lots of different ways of scoring points. There's this really neat thing where on the corner of each of the towers for the score track, if you perfectly plan and time your scoring to land your score marker onto those corners or onto those towers, you collect these bonus tiles, these bonus tokens that will score you additional points at the end of the game. I like this game. I did not play it at all actually in 2021. I don't think I played any Carcassonne in 2021, which might be a very good reason as to why this game has lowered, but I still appreciate it. My favorite Carcassonne, there's a spoiler there, there's no other Carcassones on this list. My favorite way to play Carcassonne and my number 60 game of all time, Carcassonne the Castle. Now we move on to my number 59, and my number 59 was also on the list last year, and it was ranked number 37, so not as much of a drop as Carcassonne the Castle, but it has dropped down a little bit, and that is Notre Dame, designed by Stefan Feld. And this game here, it's one of Stefan Feld's ugliest games, but at the same time, one of my favorites. Players are basically partaking in this little pick and pass card draft at the beginning of each of the rounds. And what that's going to determine, those cards that you draft, you're going to draft 3 cards, but you're only going to play 2 of those cards because you're only going to take 2 actions per round. But you still want to think about which is your 3rd card potentially, because you want to give yourself some options, because as the round unfolds, you might change your mind as to which would be the 2nd of those 2 actions you could take. But basically, you're doing different things. You're collecting tokens that can exponentially get you points by traveling around town, traveling around Notre Dame and moving your carriage around. You're also investing into the cathedral or the church of Notre Dame itself in order to have a majority. There's a little bit of a majority system taking place there to score points that way. You're doing lots of little things, collecting points in so many different ways. You have your own little player board, which is your section of Notre Dame, which is divided into seven different sectors corresponding to the 7 different possible actions that you could take as a player. You draft the services, or you pay for the services of a person in the village, a character at the end of each round that will give you a specific benefit. But these characters, there's always 3 available. They're also going to have these rat symbols on the bottom of those cards. And those rat symbols are going to determine the plague advance on the plague track for that round. And if you do not have enough hospitals, enough parks to counter that plague and bring some health to your section of Notre Dame, then you are going to suffer the consequences, which is typically in the comes in the form of a loss of prestige, which are your victory points at the end of the game. So you're trying to find all these different ways of scoring points. It's a point salad indeed, but at the same time, you want to mitigate that bad luck. You want to mitigate the consequences of that play track by trying to account for that and invest in some decisions that will help you advance your hospital systems. Really cool. Again, not a pretty looking game, but a fun game. For me at least, my number 59 board game of all time, Notre Dame. And now we move on to my number 58, and my number 58 is the first of the 2 new games for this section, debuting pretty high for a new game, and that is Arkham Horror, 2nd edition in particular, designed originally by Richard Launius and also with the help of Kevin Wilson for this 2nd edition and published by Fantasy Flight Games. I am a big fan of the Fantasy Flight Arkham Horror file line of games. I am a big fan of lots of other games, which I will not mention, which may be higher than this game on this list. But this game, I've only played it a few times. I think I've played it like 3, maybe 4 times, which actually for how lengthy of a game it is not too little. I like playing this cooperatively, but I think I even prefer it playing it solo. And it's such an immersive experience, and it's exactly why I perhaps prefer it solo, because I feel like I could take the game at my pace and I can get a little bit more immersed into the narrative that's saturated with each and every single card that you draw in this game. And there's so many cards to draw from. Not only are you drawing skills and allies and common and unique items to add to your player or your investigator's pool in order to strengthen their abilities and their stats, but you're also drafting from all these different encounter decks based on the section of Arkham City that you find yourself in. And basically these encounters are filled with lots of narrative, some decisions, but quite often lots of stat checks. You're rolling dice based on your character's particular stats, and you're trying to resolve them positively in order to win some benefit or some favor, or avoid some detrimental consequence and disastrous results that can actually hinder your characters, hurt them, maybe take away their life or their sanity. This game has, the investigators have 2 different types of health currencies, which is very typical from the Arkham Horror file line of games. Again, I enjoy the Cthulhu theming, the Lovecraftian theme in this game. I enjoy the ambiance, the artwork, and the graphic design on this classic board. It might be antiquated in the eyes of some, but I really appreciate it. And I really enjoy the immersive experience that is the game. It's a very tough game to win, but when you do win, when you are successful, it's very satisfying. My number 58 board game of all time, Arkham Horror 2nd edition. And now we move on to my number 57. And my number 57 was also on the list last year. It's another big drop, just like Carcassonne the Castle earlier. This game was actually ranked in my top 20, particularly number 17 last year. And it's dropped down 40 spots down to 57, and that is Pandemic the Cure. And this is the dice iteration of Pandemic, which has already made it on my list. Pandemic, I lumped up Iberia, the other iterations, and the legacy versions all into one spot, and it was ranked, I think, somewhere in the 60s. But Pandemic the Cure is still my favorite way of playing Pandemic. It's a little bit quicker, and I like the customized dice. Basically, every character has customized set of dice that further distinguish him or her from all of the other characters around the table. The powers in regular Pandemic, they're cool, they're neat, but the dice here really make you feel distinct because you have faces on your die that nobody else has, or the particular configuration of your 6 faces of your die are different than other players. Even the amount of dice you roll might be different from one player to the other. And it's a really challenging game. I find that it's more swingy than Pandemic due to the fact that you're rolling dice, so there is an element of luck, but you'll be surprised how little luck there is for this being a dice game, because there are lots of ways that the game design mitigates for that random factor of rolling the dice. Each of the characters feel different. Every time you play this game, it's always exhilarating, always exciting, even when you get crushed by the game. My number 57 board game of all time, Pandemic the Cure. And now we make it to my number 56, another game that was on the list last year. This game was actually ranked number 68, so it's the first game on this set of 10 to actually rise up the list, 12 spots that is, and that is Tiny Epic Galaxies by Scott Alms and Gamelin Games. And this game here is now currently my favorite Tiny Epic game. Actually, There might be one higher. But it's definitely among the top 2 Tiny Epic games for me on my list. And my Tiny Epic games, these are my travel games. As you can see, the box is very small, but it packs a punch. It has a nice little medium weight game to it with some nice themes, some decent table presence, and a good length to the game. There's some bite to these games. However, they come in a very portable package, and it's so convenient for travel. So when I travel, I usually take with me 3 or 4 of these Tiny Epic games, along with some other small box games in my collection, but these are a staple. And I must say that Tiny Epic Galaxies is usually among the games that I take from the Tiny Epic collection. I always mix and match a little bit for variety's sake, but I find myself going back to this game. It's a solid game, plays great multiplayer and solo. My number 56 board game of all time, Tiny Epic Galaxies. My number 55 board game of all time is another small box game, and that is One Deck Dungeon. And this game here, lots of people give it flack. A lot of people don't appreciate it, but I definitely do. This basically brings a dungeon crawl experience into one deck of cards. And there's always 4 decks of cards, or 4 cards that can at most comprise your dungeon. And if you see, the back of the cards have some artwork depicting doors that you can open and see what's behind. And there's always an encounter, either some dangerous, perilous encounter, or a monster, an enemy you have to defeat, right? Like this wraith right here. And if you look at the cards, they have these color-coded boxes here that have a number, and again, as I mentioned, a color. And that corresponds to the different colored dice that you are rolling throughout the game in order to try to resolve these encounters or defeat these monsters. And the number there basically tells you the total pip value of all the dice of that color that you must invest in order to fulfill that box and cover it up successfully. Now, there's also some icons on these boxes here that tell you the consequences of being unable to cover those boxes, because technically you're going to walk out of every encounter successful, but at the same time, if you don't cover these boxes, you might have to expend time, which would mean you would have to draw cards from the deck, and each time the deck runs out, you descend to the next level of the dungeon where things are getting tougher, and eventually, ultimately, you must face the big bad. So if your character's not ready, too bad, so sad. You're descending to that next level if you run out of that deck. Now, you also have these heart symbols. That means you're going to suffer that much damage if you don't cover these boxes. So you want to cover these boxes as much as possible. And each of these different colors correspond to different potential stats, such as a character's agility, their magic, and their physical combat. Good amount of variety here in the base game alone. You have 5 different characters to choose from, not to mention 5 different bosses or overlords with their corresponding dungeons or labyrinths, which make every game feel different and distinct from one another. And there's also an expansion. I do not own it. It's the Shadow of the Forest, something along those lines, which add 5 new characters and 5 new overlords or bosses, not to mention a couple other additional rules that are sprinkled into the mix. I like this game. Again, like Tiny Epic Galaxies, this game here is a travel-friendly game, even smaller of a box. Just such a convenient travel buddy for me. And again, this is quite often one of the games that I take with me when I go traveling. My number 55 board game of all time, One Deck Dungeon. Now we move on to my number 54. And my number 54, also previously on the list for several years. This game was ranked number 72 last time. So it's actually climbed up. One Deck Dungeon, by the way, was ranked number 74. So we have a couple games here that are actually climbing up. And that is Kingdom Builder, my number 54. And this is a Donald X Vaccarino game, a Spiel des Jahres winner from Days Yonder. And this is a game that a lot of people don't talk about, but I find it to be such a cool game for what it is. It's a short game. This game plays around half an hour. It's very abstracted. It's not as grandiose as the cover art might let you think. Basically, you got this modular board that you create, and it consists of different terrain types, and players are placing their settlements onto these terrain types 3 at a time per turn, and trying to link together certain features or castles or trying to put their settlements near certain features like the water or the mountain or canyons or what have you in order to score points. And the neat thing about this game is that not only is the board modular, but the scoring is modular because you have these kingdom cards. And the base game comes with about 10 of them, and each expansion adds another 3 or 4 of them. So you have a good amount of these kingdom cards, but you're only picking 3 of these kingdom cards per game. And these 3 kingdom cards determine how you score. So you cannot bring one strategy from one game to the other because you have to factor in real time, what are your current objectives and what do I have to do in order to score as many points possible with what I have in front of me right now and right there. Again, just a fun, enjoyable game, pretty abstracted. Some people don't like the fact that you only have 1 card to choose from each turn in order to place down your settlements. You could always house rule that and give yourself 2. I prefer to actually play as is written in the rules with just 1 card, and it works just fine for me. My number 54 board game of all time, Kingdom Builder. And now we move on to my number 53. And my number 53, also previously on the list for many years. This game was ranked number 48 last year, so it has dropped down a few spots, but I must say it's actually holding steadier than I thought it would because I think I only played this game 1 time in 2021. And that is Seven Wonders Duel, a co-design by Antoine Bauza and Bruna Cathala. And this is basically the 2-player iteration of Seven Wonders. It solved the 2-player problem that Seven Wonders originally did not. Although I am not a hater of the Seven Wonders 2-player variant, as some people might be, I have to admit that it's not optimal and that this is definitely the way to go in order to recreate that Seven Wonders experience with only 2 players. Now, this game here, I just recently, in 2021, the one time I played, I did play with the Pantheon expansion, and I think that maybe is one of the reasons why it's holding steady, the novelty of experiencing that expansion. Not to mention the fact that in 2020, I played the print and play solo expansion that came out and played it a good amount of times, and that kept it in the forefront of my mind because I know that whenever I want to, if I want to, I can play this game solo. Really cool game. I enjoy it every time I play it. 2-player only for whenever I want to get my Seven Wonders itch. I want to scratch that itch, but I do not have the people around me to play a bigger game. My number 53 board game of all time, Seven Wonders Duel. And now we move on to my number 52, another game that was on the list last year. This has been on my list for several years, and it was ranked number 32. It's dropped down 20 spots, a game that I did not play at all in 2021, and that might be a reason why. And that is Puerto Rico, designed by Andreas Seyfarth. And this classic of a game that came out 20 years ago now. This game has been around for over 2 decades and was ranked number 1 on BoardGameGeek.com for many, many years. If you don't know that, do your research and check that out. This game is still ranked very highly on BGG. It is a classic in every sense of the word. It is an evergreen. I do enjoy it. I have not played it in 2021, but I do have plans to play it in 2022. And not only that, I do have plans of trying out some expansions. I bought the Buildings expansion and the Nobles expansion, and I have a feeling that that's going to help the game at least retain its current spot more or less. I have a hard time seeing this game drop down by more than 10 or 15 spots going into next year because I think the excitement and, again, the novelty of trying out that new expansion should at least help it remain steady, if not maybe even help it bump up a few spots once again. My number 52 board game of all time, Puerto Rico. And now we move on to my number 51, the last board game for this list, and how appropriate that the last one will be a new game to the list, the second new one in this particular section. Played it for the first time last year, and it's already had a good impression, so much so that it's actually number 51 and just barely made it, or barely missed from making it into my top 50. And that is Arcadia Quests, and this is designed by a group of designers, Guilherme Goulart, Tiago Arana, Fred Perret, and Eric M. Lang, and published by Command Games. And as a product of Command Games, you can imagine it has very high quality miniatures. This game here is such a fun game. This is a dungeon crawl style game, completely competitive, because instead of the players controlling a band of heroes, Each individual player has his or her own band of heroes consisting of 3 different characters that are all vastly different as far as their powers are concerned, as far as their melee versus ranged combat, and different statistics and variable player powers. Really cool. You have this kind of like AI system as far as how monsters or bad guys operate. There is no overlord in this game. No overlord necessary. All the players take on a group of heroes. And the campaign is neat. It's a short campaign. It's only 6 games. You have a bunch of different quests to potentially pick from, but you only end up playing 6 before the campaign is wrapped up and a winner is declared. The system, the leveling up system, works really cool. The monsters level up progressively along or in correlation with the heroes and the quests that they're making it to. You shop for different items in between quests that allow players to strengthen their characters' attack and defense abilities, perhaps even their movement abilities. You acquire different skills. Some of the scenarios have a special artifact that one player or all the players are racing to be the first to collect that artifact, because that will be a very powerful weapon or piece of equipment going forward for the rest of the campaign. Really cool to play as a campaign. Really cool to play if you just want to play it as one-off missions as well. Just fun, very basic, very simple. Reminds me a lot of a game like Hero Quest. You just have 2 basic actions that your heroes can pick from each turn. But it has this neat mechanism where each character has a couple of items unique to them. And every time you choose to use one of those items, you have to place a token on it, basically indicating that you've exhausted that item. Not necessarily that character, that item. But over the course of the game, you're going to exhaust all the items on a particular character. And it's going to make that character very limited. At that point, the character can only move around the dungeon. They won't be able to take any special actions because basically all the different actions a character can take are tied or linked to these particular weapons or equipment that they've already exhausted. So at this point, they are forced to take a refresh action, basically do nothing with their turn in order to remove all those exhaust tokens from their character and from their character's cards so that they can take those actions and use those equipment on future turns. Now, the cool thing is you're not necessarily going to be forced to do the refresh too often because you do have 2 other heroes that form your band, so you could always choose to just activate one of those heroes on your turn. But eventually, you're going to have to refresh or else you're not going to be able to accomplish the objectives of that particular quest and or scenario. Really fun. I like the miniatures. I like the graphic design style with the chibi artwork and miniatures. And it's a lighthearted, again, very simplistic, almost hearkening to the classic dungeon crawl style games of yesteryear. My number 51 board game of all time, Arcadia Quest. And that's it for today's list, folks. Thank you so much for joining us here when Harry Met Board Games. Please comment down below and tell me what you think about this particular set of 10 games. And don't miss us next time as I continue the top 100, cracking into the top 50 of all time, with numbers 50 to 41 next time. All right, that's it for today, guys. Thank you for joining us here at When Harry Met Board Games. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.